The first email from the Homeowners Association arrived exactly 3 days after we moved to Maple Valley Estates. My mom had just put up the last garden gnome, a small reminder of my dad, when the envelope showed up in the mailbox. A $150 fine for unauthorized decorations visible from the street. Welcome to the neighborhood. I guess I should have known right then that moving here would be a nightmare. After losing my dad 5 years ago, I finally convinced my mom to sell the family house and move closer to me. At 35 and working as a chemistry teacher at Westfield High, I thought I could secure a peaceful retirement for her in this seemingly idyllic community. Subscribe to the channel and hit like for more stories like this. But Diane Evans had other plans. As president of the Homeowners Association, Diane turned her role into a kind of middle-class tyranny. At 58, with her hair always perfectly in place and smiles that never reached her eyes, she roamed the neighborhood with her rulebook as if it were her Bible, and apparently, we were the sinners. The statues need to be removed within 48 hours, she insisted on our doorstep the next day, with her husband Howard standing silently behind her. Rules are there to keep property values up. They're memories of my late husband, my mom tried to explain, showing how each sculpture represented a place they had visited together. Diane just raised an eyebrow. Feelings don't increase property value. In the following weeks, more letters kept coming. A fine for faded paint. Another for plants that aren't native in the garden. In 2 months, we were nearly $800 in debt to the HOA. But the money was the least of our problems. My mom started getting sick. At first, it was just occasional dizziness. Then, constant nausea and fatigue. Dr. Lawson, clearly puzzled, suggested it might be stress from the move, or even depression. He prescribed vitamins and regular checkups. But she just kept getting worse. "Have you been eating well, Mom?" I asked one night, worried about the barely touched plate in front of her. "I've been trying," she replied, her voice weaker than I remembered. "I just feel constantly poisoned." That word kept echoing in my head. As a chemist, I know hundreds of substances that could cause those symptoms. I started noticing patterns. Did she feel worse after a bath? After drinking tap water? I began jotting everything down. It was on a Saturday morning that I noticed something odd. Howard Evans, Diane's husband, was crouched near our water meter at 5:30 in the morning. When he saw me watching through the window, he quickly pretended to be looking for something in the grass. After he left, I checked and found small blue droplets near the connection. That same afternoon, I set up some discrete cameras. 2 nights later, at 3:12 in the morning, I caught Howard dumping a liquid where our water line hooked up to the main system. The picture wasn't perfect, but there was no doubt. It was him. I secretly collected water samples and took them to the school lab on Sunday. The test confirmed it. Ethylene glycol, antifreeze. In small amounts, it caused exactly the symptoms my mom had. In larger doses over time, it could be fatal. My hand shook as I held the report. They were trying to drive us out. Or worse. At the police station, the sergeant looked at my evidence skeptically. The video shows someone messing with the meter, but we can't clearly see what's being done. And the antifreeze in the water, well, it could come from a lot of places. But the behavior patterns, the veiled threats. "Mr. Wilson, we need concrete proof to charge someone with attempted murder." I left there knowing that justice wasn't coming down the normal channels. I took my mom to the hospital that very day, making up an excuse about visiting relatives. We couldn't go back to that contaminated house. While she got treatment, I started my own investigation. If the police needed stronger evidence, I'd find it. I discovered something interesting while looking into the neighborhood water supply. Maple Valley Estates didn't get water from the city. The supply was controlled by a private company called Purestone LLC, which was on the brink of bankruptcy. I immediately called Anthony, a college friend who became a lawyer specializing in water rights. "Are you sure about this, Jackson? Buying a water supply company is serious business. They tried to kill my mom, Anthony. I need something serious right now." To raise the money, I sold my car, drained my retirement account, and mortgaged my house. $250,000 later, I was the new owner of Purestone LLC, the sole owner of the water rights for Maple Valley Estates, including the Evans house. Now I was the boss of the water. I have to admit that in those first days, holding that Purestone LLC acquisition contract, I felt a mix of power and terror. Power, because I finally had a way to fight back against those who had poisoned my mom. Terror, because I'd just risked everything on a failing company. But as they say, desperate times call for desperate measures. "You understand that this is temporary, right?" Anthony warned as we signed the final documents. "If they find out you're using your position for revenge, They'll sue you until you have nothing left. It's not revenge, I replied, although I knew it was exactly that. It's just a market adjustment. The next day, I sent out a new rate schedule to all the residents of Maple Valley Estates. The water rate had jumped 400%. It wasn't illegal. The company had been in the red for years, which technically justified the increase. I included a note explaining that extraordinary circumstances had forced the hike, but that we were open to individual agreements for residents who wanted to discuss the new charges in person. The phone started ringing at 7:03 in the morning. I ignored all the calls except one. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Diane's voice was icy, but I could detect something I'd never heard before. Fear. "Just making sure the company that supplies our neighborhood stays financially viable, Mrs. Evans. Worried about the bills?" "This is extortion." "No, Diane. Extortion would be if I were charging you not to poison your water, like someone did with my mom." Silence. Then, "I have no idea what you're talking about." "I'm sure you don't. By the way, I installed new filters and monitoring systems on all the main lines. Any strange substance will be immediately detected and traced back to its source. Just to ensure quality, you know?" She hung up. An hour later, Howard showed up at my door. "We can't pay that amount," he said, sounding less threatening than I expected. Somehow he seemed smaller. "No one can." "There are conditions for normalizing the rates," I said, inviting him in. He refused, staying on the porch. "First, a public confession about what you did with my mom's water. Second, you guys get out of this neighborhood for good. Third, you set up a fund to cover her medical expenses." "That's absurd. We have no idea what happened to your mom." I showed him the video on my phone. It didn't fully nail him, but it was obvious it was him at our meter in the middle of the night. "I have more evidence," I lied. "Enough to make sure you spend the rest of your lives in jail." Howard swallowed hard. "I need to talk to Diane. You have 48 hours to decide. After that, I'm sending everything to the police, to every resident in this neighborhood, and to all the local newspapers. Oh, and your water rate goes up again. Double." After Howard left, I started getting visits from other neighbors. Desperate, worried about their astronomical water bills. I offered significant discounts to anyone who agreed to come to an emergency HOA meeting that I was organizing. It was cruel to use water as a weapon. I knew that, but I had to make sure everyone heard the truth. Robert, my neighbor, who had always been friendly even during Diane's reign of terror, was the first to offer support. "I've never liked the way they treated people," he confided after I partially explained the situation. "Especially your mom. Diane seemed fixated on you from day one. Do you know why?" He hesitated. "Your house used to belong to the Hendersons. They were the only ones who openly challenged Diane. When Mr. Henderson died and Mrs. Henderson moved to a nursing home, Diane said she could finally clean up that part of the neighborhood." A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just about us. On the day of the meeting, the community center was packed. Some residents looked furious, others confused, but everyone was there. Fear of astronomical water bills is a powerful motivator. Diane and the treasurer, Kevin Parker, were seated at the main table, with Howard hiding in the back. When I walked in, the murmurs died down. Diane smiled, that professional smile that never reached her eyes. "Mr. Wilson, glad you could join us. We were just discussing your questionable acquisition." I climbed onto the small stage without being invited. "Good evening, everyone. First, I want to apologize for the shock with the new water rates. I promise this will be resolved soon, one way or another." "One way or another?" Kevin Parker shot back. "That sounds like a threat." "Not as much as poisoning someone, Mr. Parker." I looked him right in the eye. "You knew, didn't you?" The silence was deafening. "Why don't we explain to everyone what happened to my mom over the past few weeks? How she was gradually poisoned through our water. How ethylene glycol was deliberately put into our supply line." Shocked murmurs filled the room. I saw Diane straighten up, her face wearing a mask of calculated indignation. "These are absurd and defamatory accusations," she declared. "Mr. Wilson is clearly unstable and using his recent acquisition to get back at us." "Unstable?" I projected on the screen the photos of the water samples, the lab results, and the grainy video of Howard at our meter. "I have all this and more. And now I'm finding out that maybe we weren't the only targets." A middle-aged woman in the third row slowly stood up. Sophia Rodriguez, who had been living alone since her divorce. "Last year, after I complained about the excessive fines, I got sick for weeks. The doctors never figured out what was wrong." Another man stood up. "My dog mysteriously died after I got into a fight with Diane over my fence." Suddenly, several people started talking at once, sharing similar stories. Diane tried to silence them by banging her gavel repeatedly, but the dam had broken. "Enough!" she finally shouted. "This is a ridiculous conspiracy. Mr. Wilson bought the water company for one reason: to blackmail us." "No, Diane," I replied calmly. "I bought it to protect my mom and, apparently, everyone else you and your husband have tormented over the years." Howard stood up at the back of the room. "Diane, I think we need to—" He was cut off by her sharp look. "Be quiet, Howard." "But they have the video." Kevin Parker looked like he was sweating. "What video exactly?" I noticed a crack forming in the trio. I seized the moment. "Mr. Parker, did you know they were poisoning people? Because as treasurer, you'd surely notice regular purchases of antifreeze on the HOA's budget." Parker paled. I just signed the checks. Diane said it was for maintaining the community pool." "Shut up, Kevin," Diane hissed. "How much maintenance does a pool really need, Mr. Parker?" I asked. "Especially considering it's been closed for renovations for the past 8 months?" The room was completely silent now. You could almost hear a pin drop. "Mr. Parker," I continued, "when it comes out that you had even indirect knowledge of the deliberate poisoning of residents, the police will consider you an accomplice, unless you speak now." It was like watching a dam break in slow motion. Parker looked at Diane, then at Howard, and finally at the room full of neighbors staring at him. "I didn't know exactly what they were doing," he began, his voice trembling. "But I knew that Diane had methods for dealing with people she considered problems." "Kevin!" Diane stood up, but 2 women in the front row prevented her from leaving. She said she was just encouraging certain residents to move out, to keep the neighborhood up to standard. She never mentioned poisoning, but he looked at me. "When your mom got sick so soon after moving in, I became suspicious, and I did nothing. I'm sorry." Sophia came up to me. "We have records, the minutes from the HOA's private meetings. Not all decisions were officially logged." The meeting turned into an impromptu trial. More stories came out. Diane tried denying everything, but Howard, seeing how things were turning, started to partly admit to some of the accusations, trying to minimize his role. By the end of the night, 3 things became clear. Most residents wanted a new HOA election immediately. Diane, Howard, and Kevin were isolated. And even with all these revelations, we still didn't have enough solid evidence for a criminal conviction. "What happens to our water now?" asked Robert when most people had already left. "The rates go back to normal tomorrow," I replied, exhausted, "except for 3 specific residences." He smiled slightly. "You know they'll try to retaliate, right?" "I'm counting on it," I answered. "But now they know we're watching." As I walked home that night, I thought about how an entire community could be manipulated for so long. The power didn't just come from the HOA rules, but from fear and collective inaction. I had broken that cycle, but the battle wasn't over yet. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I have something you need to see. About the Evans. Meet me tomorrow in the park at 10. While exhaustion finally got the better of me, I thought of my mom, still in the hospital but improving a little bit each day. "We're almost there, Mom," I murmured to myself. Almost there. The morning sun was high when I got to the community park. I looked around, trying to find whoever had sent the mysterious message. The area was nearly empty except for a few runners and a woman sitting on a bench, absorbed in her phone. When I got closer, she looked up. It was Linda, the longtime HOA secretary who was always quiet at meetings, always taking notes, always invisible. "I wasn't sure if you'd show up," she said, glancing nervously around. "What do you have to show me?" I asked, sitting next to her. Linda hesitated, then pulled a USB drive out of her purse. "I used to work at the same pharmaceutical company as Diane before she retired. In the committee files, I always thought it was strange how she meticulously documented some things while leaving others out." She handed me the USB drive. "Last night, after that chaotic meeting, I went to the HOA office to grab some documents. I ended up finding this in a secret drawer in her desk. What's on here? A video? And some files? She and Howard, they didn't start this in Maple Valley." Linda lowered her voice. "Apparently, they did something similar in the previous neighborhood. A woman died. My blood went cold." "Did you watch it?" Linda nodded, looking visibly disturbed. "They recorded a conversation, I think as insurance in case something went wrong. It's disturbing. And there's a digital diary detailing problems, people they targeted over the past 5 years. My mom wasn't the first here, just the most recent." "Why are you giving me this? Why didn't you take it to the police?" She sighed deeply. Because I'm next on that diary list. After you. Diane wrote that I know too much about internal procedures. I was terrified last night, couldn't sleep. I don't want to end up like your mom. Or worse. I thanked Linda and promised to protect her identity. On my way home, my mind raced trying to process this new information. It wasn't just about the HOA rules or our garden. It was something darker, more calculated. At home, I plugged the USB drive into my computer with trembling fingers. The first file was a video dated 6 months ago. It showed Diane and Howard in their home office, casually chatting as if they were planning dinner, not poisoning someone. Ethylene glycol worked on the Hendersons, but it took too long, Diane said while checking her notes. We need something more efficient for the old lady. The son is a chemistry teacher, so we have to be careful. What if we tried arsenic? Howard suggested, as casually as if he were suggesting a brand of coffee. It's harder to detect at low doses. Too risky. Let's stick with the original plan but ramp it up gradually. She doesn't have many years left anyway. I watched in horror as they coldly discussed the previous treatments. People who had mysteriously gotten sick, some who moved away, one who died. They were speaking in half codes, but clear enough. The second file was even more disturbing. A meticulous digital diary detailing every problem Diane had solved over the years. Names, dates, methods, outcomes. My mom was there too, with detailed notes about her declining health and observations about our daily routines. The clinical accuracy was nauseating. I picked up the phone to call the police, but then I stopped. This was exactly the kind of evidence we needed. But how could I explain where I got it from? Linda could be charged with breaking in. I needed to think carefully. After hours of thinking, I made a decision. I made copies of all the files and sent them to 3 people. Anthony, my lawyer, Robert, my trusted neighbor, and an anonymous email address I set up just for this. Then, using that anonymous email, I sent the videos and documents to every resident of Maple Valley Estates, including the Evans, with a simple message. The truth about our homeowners association. Chaos broke out immediately. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Text messages flooded in. People started showing up at my door, some crying, others furious, many just in shock. At 2 p.m., police cruisers parked in front of the Evans house. I watched from my window while Howard was taken away in handcuffs. Surprisingly, Diane wasn't home. I got a call from Sophia. She's in the community pool house. She locked herself inside with some files. The police are trying to negotiate. I drove over right away. A small crowd had gathered, kept at a distance by officers. Through the glass windows, I saw Diane frantically tearing up papers and throwing things into a trash can. The sergeant who had dismissed my concerns weeks ago now looked extremely serious. Mr. Wilson, we need you to step back. This is potentially dangerous. She's destroying evidence, I shouted. We know. The perimeter is secured. At that moment, Kevin Parker arrived, escorted by 2 officers. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in one day. I made a full confession, he told me, sounding both defeated and relieved. I knew more than I admitted yesterday. At first, it was just about excessive fines and harassment. Then, well, I turned a blind eye. I signed the checks. I never questioned it. 2 hours later, Diane finally surrendered, coming out with her head down, but still with that air of superiority. As she passed by me, she whispered just for my ears, "You don't understand what you've done. Some people just don't belong here. We were protecting our way of life." "You were killing people," I replied simply. The next few days were a whirlwind. The local press swarmed Maple Valley Estates. The story was too sensational to ignore. HOA president poisoned residents to keep neighborhood exclusive. Investigations revealed that the Evans had moved to 5 different neighborhoods over the past 20 years, always taking roles in local administration and always leaving sick or dead people behind. At an emergency meeting, Sophia was elected interim HOA president, with promises of a complete overhaul of the rules. Her very first act was to scrap the ban on garden sculptures. My mom was finally discharged from the hospital a week later. When I brought her home, she burst into tears at the sight. Neighbors lined our street, each holding a small garden sculpture, a symbolic act of healing. "I don't understand," she said, overwhelmed. "Why are they doing this?" "Because finally, we're a real community," I said, helping her out of the car. Robert approached with a particularly colorful garden gnome. "To replace the ones that were broken," he explained, "and to show that we're all in this together." The water company issue still needed to be resolved. One quiet morning, I gathered my new allies, Sophia, Robert, Anthony, and some other residents who had become friends, to discuss the future of Purestone LLC. Technically, you could keep owning it, Anthony explained. But considering everything that happened, I don't want that power, I interrupted. It was necessary at the time, but now it would be wrong. After a lot of discussion, we came up with a solution. We'd transfer ownership of the company to a community fund managed by an elected council, separate from the HOA. Every household would get an equal share, and the profits would be reinvested in neighborhood improvements and to help residents in financial trouble. The Margaret Wilson Healing Garden was unveiled 2 months later in the center of the neighborhood. It was a circular space with benches and dozens of miniature sculptures donated by residents. Each sculpture represented a memory, a hope, or a tribute. My mom, now fully recovered, spent hours there every day, telling the children stories about each sculpture. Her face had regained its color, and her laughter filled the air again. In the center of the garden, a small plaque simply read, "A community is built on trust, not rules," in memory of those who suffered in silence. The Evans and Parker were convicted. Investigations continue in other neighborhoods where they lived, unearthing similar stories of bullying and poisoning. Their motives remained murky, a toxic mix of control, hidden prejudice, and a warped sense of entitlement about who deserved to live in their neighborhood. One quiet afternoon, I found a letter in the mailbox. It had no return address, just my handwritten name. Inside was a simple card that said, "Thank you for saving us." It wasn't signed, but I recognized Linda's handwriting. Sitting on the porch with my mom, watching the kids playing freely in gardens that used to be so tightly watched, I thought about how something as simple as a garden gnome could trigger so much horror and eventually so much healing. "You know," my mom said, smiling at a group of neighbors who passed by waving, "your dad always said that a man's true character shows when he has power over others." "And what do you think he'd say about how I used mine?" I asked, thinking about the water company and everything that happened. She squeezed my hand. "He'd say that the real victory wasn't in buying the water. It was in knowing when to let it go." Subscribe to the channel and hit like for more stories like this. That night, I added my own sculpture to the community garden, a small ceramic water meter, a subtle reminder that the most valuable resources, water, trust, community, belong to all of us, and that real power lies in protecting them, not controlling them. In Maple Valley Estates, we finally had a home, and we didn't need a tyrannical HOA to tell us how to live in it.